Joining us now from Loyola Law School, teaches election law at Loyola, is Jessica Levinson, and also Dan Schnur, who teaches political communication at the University of California, Berkeley, and at USC. So thanks to both of you. So Jessica, on the legal aspect of this, we're going to have multiple lawsuits regarding Title VI of the Civil Rights Code. Explain why that's in play here.
So Title VI is a federal law. It's part of the Civil Rights Act, and it says to places that get federal assistance, you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, color, or national origin. And I think the allegation here is that the schools, in part, in failing to do things, or other individuals in taking specific actions, have created an environment that gives rise to a Title VI violation. Now, what are we specifically talking about? Maybe it's blocking people from getting to school. Maybe it's disrupting and or leading to the cancellation of school events. Maybe it's creating a hostile environment. But what we're looking for is the type of action that falls disproportionately on those protected categories. Again, race, color, national origin. And we're looking for any place like a private university that gets a lot of federal funding, or a public university.
Most people think of a protest, they think of maybe a picket line or a rally. They don't think of, I'm going to set up an encampment here, we're going to put stakes down on these tents, we're going to essentially privatize public space. How is that protected?
So I know everybody loves this. It depends. And it depends on a couple of different factors. Now, we certainly have had long protests. I mean, in getting the passage of the American Disabilities Act, we had very long sit-ins and protests. But what I think we need to look at here in terms of the calculus, number one is if it is a public university or if it's a private university in California, because we have something called the Leonard Act that essentially applies the First Amendment to campus activities, that we need to look to see if when campus enforcement or police say you need to move from this encampment, would they do that regardless of who's there and what they're saying? Then with respect to how long, I mean, to your question of how long that camp out, how long the protest really takes, then we do have questions of what is actually happening to the other students as a result. What is happening to their educational opportunities as a result of people deciding essentially to temporarily live in a place in order to protest a certain position.
So, Dan, we haven't seen much from Governor Gavin Newsom. He has put out statements, but he has news conferences quite often. He has not had an on-camera statement about this. Is that a surprise?
It's not particularly surprising. Gavin Newsom is at his best when he's on the offense. So when he's talking about abortion rights, when he's talking about climate change, when he's talking about issues that unify the Democratic Party, he's one of the most effective and most impactful spokespersons in the country. On an issue like this one, which has really divided the Democratic Party, it's not surprising at all that he's keeping a much, much lower profile. He has spoken out against violence, which is fine. And to give him fair credit, I know that his staff has been coordinating with the UC system on dealing with these protests. But in terms of a public presence, no, we're not seeing much at all, and it should not be surprising in the slightest.
So, Dan, we just had a representative from a faculty group saying it's not the message, it's the principle of their right, the students' rights to protest peacefully, that should be honored, and that they would stand in front of police if indeed they thought students were being treated unfairly, regardless of what their message was. And indeed, you do have a campus, again, where we see so much of this being student on student. That's the dynamic here in a way we haven't seen before.
Well, Conan, you're always gracious enough to invite me onto your program as an analyst, not as an advocate for any particular party or cause or issue. But that said, it is fairly clear that this situation is being handled in a much, much different way than any other protest would, particularly a protest against an other underrepresented minority group. We were talking earlier about the distinction between this situation and the challenge that we as a country faced during the Vietnam War. There's one other important difference in addition to the legal considerations that Jessica mentioned. In the protests against the Vietnam War, None of them, none of those protests were directed against Americans of Southeast Asian descent. So in addition to the fact that you have two groups of students and two communities on different sides of this debate, for many of the protesters, not all, but for many of the protesters, their message is not simply directed against a U.S. government policy, but against another community of fellow Americans. And that complicates matters, not just legally, but politically also, which is one of the reasons you're seeing leading Democrats like Biden and Newsom being so circumspect.
Dan Schnur of the University of California, Berkeley, and USC, Jessica Levinson of Loyola Law School, thanks for taking the time. Up next, Father Gregory Boyle of Boyle Heights gets a righteous honor from the White House when we return.